What do I work as? Well, I'm a consultant psychiatrist, and my background was in jointly child and adolescent psychiatry and in learning disability psychiatry. But I've ended up working in two parts of the job. One in a learning disability forensic service, which is misnamed because I have 11 low secure beds that are autism specific, as well as some learning disability beds. And that's for people with Asperger's syndrome as well. And we're currently building 12 medium secure beds because people need a specialist service. I'm not suggesting that everybody with autism ends up in secure services. Alongside that, I work in an adult autism service that spans our trust, and that does assessments across mental health and learning disability right across the whole area. It started as a tiny pilot and was overwhelmed by 200 referrals. And within that, we do sensory assessments on most of the people that we see. So what's that got to do with anything? It's about understanding an individual and understanding where the difficulties are. Somebody asked this morning about separating out mental health symptoms. And if you don't do proper assessments, you can't separate them out. You may wonder why I got a strange picture. It's quite a glamorous picture, isn't it? This is from Whitby Goth Weekend on Saturday. And you might not be able to tell that I'm wearing a corset and a bustle, and I'm all steampunk. The point of this is, I might look a bit odd. You might see something that's a bit different, but you don't know what it is. You won't look at that and think, she's a forensic psychiatrist. But you might think something's unusual, and it's only when you see a whole collection of things together that are different that you start to make sense of it. And autism's like that. And I always say to people when we're doing assessments around autism, it's like doing a 2,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. And if you miss bits of that puzzle out, you will not understand that person. And sensory stuff, integration, yes, but sensory stuff, sensory issues is a huge part of that jigsaw puzzle. So, how did I start thinking about it? Because all my colleagues thought I was nuts. In fact, they weren't the only ones that I thought I was nuts, but I'll come on to this lot. I was doing an assessment a couple of years ago, and I tend to wear lots of stuff. And after 20 minutes of jangling bracelets, the man I was talking to left the room to vomit. And I assumed it wasn't because he found me so intensely unappealing. It was the noise. And his behaviour, his presentation in mental health, was mainly governed by his sensory sensitivities. But it wasn't considered to be that. It was only during the assessment that was revealed. I'll come back to him. And a lady, she was stripping. She was referred with challenging behaviour and possibly autism. Without doubt she had autism, not a learning disability. And she was stripping whenever she was wearing her nightie in the home that she was in. Interestingly, when she had her warm, thick dressing gown on, tightly fastened, she didn't strip. And it started me thinking, what is going on with these people? Because risperidone wasn't going to fix it. Well, it might have over-sedated, but it wasn't going to fix it. And this 19-year-old woman who was walking around the unit with her hood up, got very, very upset if people were noisy or loud around her, and to confuse staff, and the word manipulation came in, when she was at her most stressed, she would go to her room and play her own choice of loud music. And that confused people. How can that be? Of course, we know that sensory sensitivities are not across the board. I am told I am a sensory seeker, and you can probably tell from what I'm wearing. And I'm like that much of the time. I can't keep still. I find it very hard to stand still on something like this. But at the end of the day, when I'm tired or when I'm stressed, the jewellery comes off, I get rid of all the jangly bits, and I like my fleecy pyjamas from Primark on the corner of the sofa. So what we seek at one time is not what we seek at another time. That doesn't mean we're manipulating a situation. But unless you assess it, you don't know that. We'll come back to the other young man and these two. So I thought, okay, I'm leaving children's services, I'm going into adult services, I need to know more about this sensory stuff. We didn't have an OT in the team at that time, and the team I was moving into had 2 OTs, and bizarrely they weren't interested in joining me in the sensory understanding. That has subsequently changed. My colleagues thought I was crackers. psychiatry colleagues tolerated it. They were very suspicious, and actually when I arrived at the 5-day Module 1 sensory integration course, I can assure you the occupational therapists were extremely suspicious to have a psychiatrist in the audience. And that suspicion continued for quite a while. But then we realised we all need to know about this. And how can this be accepted if it's just talked about by one particular profession? Everybody needs to know about it. We've talked about the evidence earlier today, so I'm not going to go through this because it's been through to some degree, and I've got printouts of some of this if anybody wants to take it with us. We use the Dunn profile, the Winnie Dunn profile. I actually find that the population I work with can't really use it as a self-rated questionnaire. It's very Americanized and the language is difficult. If you've got a learning disability, and even for those people with a really good cognitive functioning, they struggle with that language, and so we use it like an interview. It doesn't lead us to go on to do sensory integration therapy, but it gives us a much greater level of understanding of that individual and their needs. So I'll go through these. When I was listening this morning, I was thinking about how this can be taken by people and used in the wrong way. And sometimes a little bit of information leads to the wrong amount of action. So you might get a professional really enthused by a day like this, and some of us have come across this, then believing they understand the world of sensory integration and apply that to everything in front of them. And that's no good either. What a day like this should show you is how much more there is to know, so you can become more aware and look at it and know where there needs to be more assessment. That's what really matters. So we'll go past these. Have a look. And I listed this morning when Sue was doing her talk, I listed these so they would be on the slides just in case we needed them later. So how do we get into this, integrated into everyday clinical practice? It is coming into DSM-5, and that's really good. But actually up in the northeast, which is where I work, we use ICD-10. We don't use DSM-5. We need it integrated into clinical practice regardless as to the classification criteria. We don't really stick to ICD-10 for our diagnosis of autism anyway. It isn't terribly helpful much of the time. ICD-11 may be much better, it may not. So we need it incorporating into what we do all of the time. And yes, we want occupational therapists specifically trained at length, but we need every professional trained to a certain degree so that they're open to it. If it becomes too specialist, and it has been in the past, and it probably still is in some areas, I can say this about psychiatrists because I am one, but the psychiatrists of the world will ignore it. They won't accept it as being part of the way that person functions. And actually, it needs to be the whole team approach that matters, with the additional specialist intervention. We moved to a new hospital in May 2010. We moved from a learning disability hospital, an old Victorian building that was knocked down in front of us. And we moved in, and one day we had an LD ward, and the next day we had 2 autism-specific wards. And it was a bit of a shell-shocked system. But along with all this sudden increase in learning was a sudden increase in awareness and staff being open to ideas. And they started to look at the environment much more as a team and assess the environment. And as we were building the medium secure unit that's still going up in front of us, they asked us as clinicians to come in and help with the interior design. They said, oh, we thought we'd do this on the flooring and there'd be swirls. We said, no, we can't do that in this kind of unit. You might not like it looking clinical, but we want it plain and calm. And they listened. The other thing that we did in our trust, you might know about the NICE guidelines for autism, and these in children's services have just come out for assessment and will come out for treatment, and they're looking at those for adult services. But last year we set up a pathway of care to assess all adults with autism, with or without IQ, no differentiation, to ensure that each person was considered individually, and within that, their sensory needs need to be assessed. You're welcome to a copy of that pathway if you want it. The whole point of it is not sticking to understanding that one person from one perspective. If you do that, you would diagnose half of the adults in mental health that I see that are referred with psychosis and not with autism or Asperger's syndrome. Going back to our jangling bracelets, this man was living in a bathroom because he couldn't stand the outside windows because of the noise outside. Ultimately, he moved to a much quieter residential area. The 36-year-old lady, once they understood about her dressing gown, they stopped letting her wander around in a t-shirt that was too loose, and she didn't go for a lycra suit or anything like that. She just didn't have clothing that touched a little bit. And our young lady with the hood up and the music, they started to recognise that traffic light system. So they would know when she needed to go to her bedroom, and when she went to her bedroom, she would play with Play-Doh or listen to loud music and learn to just regulate herself. The 24-year-old man, I didn't mention him, in the old hospital, he couldn't cope with any lack of structure, but it wasn't recognised. And he used to ram his hands down the back of the radiators and eat the insides of his DS and stick them up his nose. That's real sensory input, isn't it? In the new hospital, he has a high level of structure and predictability, and when he's struggling, he goes to the calm room and he buries himself into the beanbag. Much better for him, much better for the staff. And this other young man, who had autism and catatonia, we heard in the last talk about how people can get overloaded and get right the way up the top of anxiety and go straight into shutdown. And that's what he was doing. And looking at the sensory profile, we learned ways of reducing his anxiety with the things that regulated him, that would stop him going up to that point and tipping over into catatonic states. I'll mention one more because you need to speak as well. We had a 39-year-old man referred, and the referral was because the number of staff that ended up in casualty, the number of attacks and assaults on staff. And what he was actually doing, he wasn't coping with a lack of structure, but when he felt safest was when he was in restraint. And actually by inputting the structure, he was an able man, but having visual representation of every day, beautifully structured, not rigid, but structured, he didn't need to escalate to the degree of assault because his anxiety was reduced. Okay, we'll leave that one. So, we had a battle, and we're lucky in our service. We've got a service that's open and excited and developing at the moment. Don't be put off by suspicion, and you have to have other professionals involved because they will wake up to it. Okay, I hand over.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. We'll get up again in a moment. And I'm just going to carry on with just looking at some case studies, so just some examples as well. And I was just going to come back and get you looking again at that model that we looked at this morning, and just reminding you that we're trying to look at and understand people's presentation from whether they're noticing things and they're on a low threshold, or they need much more intense input, and whether they're passive or active. And the sort of people that we might be meeting is, this links very nicely with the talk that we had just earlier, our sensation avoider. So that exercise around, what do you do when you go to the supermarket? Strategies of cutting down the noise, being very focused so that all the outside input is not going to distract you too much. So do you see, I'm just going to think, how many people you think that you might be working with who might be using those active strategies, very active strategies. Then the person who has exactly the same sensitivities, and this is Sherry, but will be maybe is unable to and doesn't move away or have the much more active strategies, so it's much more passive. And I'm actually really worried about people like Sherry. And although, I know we're talking about primarily people on the autistic spectrum, but again, just think about those individuals who might also have a physical disability or might be in a wheelchair and may have less opportunity to be active in their strategies. Now, how many of you come across Sean? The person who is the huge risk taker. I quite frequently had the telephone call that's going, Ros, I think we really need you to pop in because we've got this lad or this person and they're on the roof again. I think, okay, this sounds interesting. This is the person who's needing that very active sensation seeking. Does some of you come across some individuals who are doing that, climbing literally onto the wardrobes, really looking for that? And then finally, Bryony, who's very much the bystander. In Winnie Dunn's book, she talks about the bystander, the person who needs the bomb under them to almost notice what's going on around them. And these are the people that you would come across. And I like these. We got one of Kath's colleagues, individuals, actually helped put these drawings together when we were explaining the sort of person that you might come across, how they present. So I just thought, Sue and the others, we briefly mentioned that I did do some research around looking at the effectiveness of sensory integration on 5 adults with learning disabilities. And interestingly, when we selected them for the study, we didn't know who would be coming into the study, but out of the 5, 3 were on the autistic spectrum. And the reason I wanted to just go through this is just to show around some individuals how we did that work. And the way in which we screened for them was we used the Reisman and Hanshrue sensory integration inventory. Some of you familiar with that one? It's what we call the pink form. It's observational. It's again a way of getting information that gives you some indicators of how somebody may be responding to or having problems around sensory processing and therefore would be open to may benefit from sensory integration therapy. That's the age group, and actually the way they came out, real reflection, they did all have sensory modulation difficulties. A lot of them had motor problems, and I would say we definitely had a sensory seeker, somebody who was more like Bryony and under-responsive, and we had 3 who were clearly over-responsive. So we did 5 single-case experimental designs, and the treatment was, the dosage, if you like, was carried out in the middle block. So over 3 months, 12 sessions, with the first one being without any treatment, but the main thing that we were measuring was how well somebody was able to perform on task, doing a horticultural task. And in the middle month, 4 weeks, the only thing that changed was that the individuals all had some sensory integration therapy session and then went out and did the task. And in the final 4 weeks, it was carrying on, but they didn't have the sensory integration therapy. And I'm just going to give you the results of one person who was definitely the seeker. And this is somebody who actually wasn't in a secure setting, but was needing 2-to-1 supervision because they had a lot of maladaptive behaviours, or rather behaviours that challenged. But actually, if you looked at it from my perspective, I was hypothesising that a lot of those were maladaptive behaviours that you could put down to sensory processing problems. And this was an individual who was using a lot of sensory seeking activity to calm. We were hypothesizing to calm his system, but that very easily that threshold, the time that he was able to stay in the calm alert state, was so narrow that he flipped into being sort of overstimulated, which led to fight-flight responses. And I say this because quite often you may be talking to me or colleagues and saying they're always in the flight-flight, but actually are the strategies of what they're doing. Somebody who actually is a sensory seeker, their neurological system, they need quite intense input and intense sensations to notice. And it's in their active strategies that they flip themselves into the fight-flight. And that's really important to sort of just stand back and think about that, because it'd be very easy to maybe be putting the wrong sort of input in. So in preparing him for sessions and input, and particularly thinking about the environment as well, he needed a lot of calming strategies to get him to the just right level of alertness. But then with scaffolding, he was able to really make use of a lot of linear moving into more alerting stimuli to get that balanced state. And some of you may or may not be able to really understand this, but what I think is really interesting is we had 3 measures. One was how much in a 10-minute session, we videoed it all, was he engaged in engaged on task when he went out and then did the horticulture task, and how much was he engaged in his maladaptive behaviours. And we picked 1 or 2 behaviours we could actually measure in 10 minutes that were more the habituated behaviours that we'd hypothesised were more to do with sensory processing problems. So here in this stage, baseline, without any SI therapy, it was all over the place, and the calculations you can do here tell you that without any input, anything else, if you carried on, it was looking like that was going to increase. So more maladaptive behaviour and level of engagement. Coming here, in the middle bit, was the ability to be on task. And I think the most significant thing for me was just seeing this was less than a minute in 10 minutes over all those sessions, 8 sessions. This individual was not needing to be engaged in maladaptive behaviour. This was goal attainment scale, so looking at the quality of the task he was able to perform, again looking really dramatic increases. But I think the thing that really I'd like you to look at is somebody who fails to engage, is all over the place, is doing lots of maladaptive behaviours, can't actually focus on task. And the moment he had the sensory integration therapy, do you see the difference there? So he was then available to be able to then focus on task, be engaged on task, and he wasn't needing to engage in all those challenging maladaptive behaviours. And I think there was a bit of a carryover here, and then over time, that was coming back up again. So that, I think, was really helpful, just because so often as OTs, so often we're trying to think, how can we get help support somebody to actually function and be able to concentrate and be able to focus and be able to do. And that's just, I think, quite an interesting way of looking at it. So that was the key thing for me, was that the functional performance of the 5 people that we were working with, and they definitely, all of them had tactile problems, was improved following sensory integration therapy. Most importantly, none of them deteriorated. There was improvement on at least 1 measure for 4 participants, and we saw those positive changes that showed improved evidence of improvement in occupational participation. I'm not going to go through this because we've already covered it this morning, I think, but that is in your notes around the sort of key things that we were making sure we covered. I know we have for those of you here just now, just pulling you back to how important being in the just right level of alertness is when we're looking at helping support, particularly for me, adults sort of on the autistic spectrum who've got intellectual disabilities. And us recognising what we need to do when we when we're anxious and when we need to calm down, or to get ourselves to be more in the right place to be able to focus. And we've covered that. Did some of you think, well, most of you here for the talk just before, so you've already, some of you have seen this, but some of the strategies again we've used would be around different ideas around helping to engage the person in what works for them around their arousal level, when things are on high, when things are on low, and how you can help to do it in a visual way to support them. So that's really nice, seeing Nikki's ones earlier. And just ideas that are around helping you thinking about things that pulling, pushing, stretching, using proprioception to modulate. How many minutes? Got 5. Okay, so I'm just going to do a very quick run through Lisa, who's an 18-year-old lass with Asperger's, and she's given permission for us to be using this for training other carers, people who support individuals with Asperger's. And she came as a referral because she was living at home with her parents, but she wanted to move from school to university, and she was really concerned about how she could do that. And she also was having a lot of difficulties managing her diabetes. And she came to the adult Asperger's team because the school counsellor was asking if they could have some clarification around the diagnosis and also things that might help her. And she was talking about being all the things that are now familiar with us through the day. She was overly sensitive to loud noises, she avoided all the sort of bright, busy, noisy shops, she'd easily get overloaded, she'd be clumsy, she couldn't go up the stairs, she crawled up the stairs. But to meet her, you would never have a clue that was an area that she had a lot of problems with. She was very sensitive to smell, she was a picky eater, she struggled to pay attention, she struggled to be able to pick up tasks, particularly at the end of a lesson at school when everybody else was getting to go up and get ready to go, and that's just when the teacher's usually saying, oh, and your homework is, and she'd always miss that instruction around what the homework was with all the noise. She liked to keep her, I'm just going to move on here, she liked to keep her room very dark and quiet, and her mum was constantly nagging her about this, and she'd tend to be quite antisocial. But her boyfriend actually understood her needs really well, and he was, in a way, supporting her and scaffolding her to be able to get out and about and try and understand it. So these are some of the things that Lisa had put together that were causing her the most difficulties. Does this look familiar? Some of the things you might sort of come across? So this was how she would describe her day, that she'd wake up with the alarm and the different types of alarms that she needed to use. Couldn't have one that would buzz, or otherwise her head would feel like it was splitting in two. She would be talking about how it felt to get dressed, how clothes bothered her a lot. So again, listening to the language, the emotional language of the way in which the narrative of her story, it tells us, doesn't it, about what hurts, what's painful. That labels in her clothes often felt like they were slicing her open like a nasty paper cut. And that really, what's this telling us? That by lunchtime, all her senses through the day were starting to get so much that she found it really difficult. And her lunch was always very much the same. She needed to go for pale food because it's a lot easier to look at than a plate of mixed foods. So the key thing here was working with her to go with a really active sort of input and really find out the sort of things that were going to help her and understand what was really difficult for her through her sensory systems, from vestibular, from tactile, and using a lot of ideas such as the weighted blankets, getting her to walk around and have all her school, she was already doing it, but actually understanding, walking around with her heavy school books in a rucksack, she said really did help her, and you can understand how that would be very helpful. But actually having permission to say, it's really good to start thinking about what you enjoy doing, what are you drawn towards. It may not be age appropriate, if you liked, that as an adult she was drawn to wanting to use swings. But actually there are a lot of them. Some of you come across the adult gyms that are now around all the play parks. They're fantastic to keep adults healthy, and older adults. Brilliant place to be able to go and use, and she was using that. Had a lot of discussion around how she could change her environment and what would support her, and that helped to, in the end, pull things together so that she could get to university and had a whole pack of things that she knew worked for her, and to be able to work with the university to support her in being able to access some of these things. So as much as anything, it was about going through with her and understanding what her real problems were and how you could support that. So thank you. And thank you to Lisa for letting us share this.